Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. The welcome's from me, Mike Scott in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC. And it's to the 25th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. And today, we're returning to the issue of Putin, Russia, and the West. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who's the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please do not use the chat button, but the Q&A button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try to put them to the panel to consider in some kind of logical order towards the end. We urge you to ask your questions, therefore, as and when they occur to you, so there is not a backlog at the end. I'm looking forward again to this discussion with our distinguished guests. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Mike. And from Washington, welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. We're thrilled to have a large international audience, as we usually do, and there will be other opportunities for people to view this discussion later on video online, and we'll make that known in due course. We have a great panel today, as Mike suggested. From Oxford, Corneliu Bjola, who is an associate professor in diplomatic studies at the University of Oxford and is particularly interested in issues of digital diplomacy in this area. He's also associated with the University of Southern California and the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. Susan Eisenhower is a policy analyst with a focus on national security. She is chair emeritus of the Eisenhower Institute and has focused particularly on arms control during her career. And we're happy to have her back with us again today. Ellen Ayanis is a reporter at Vox News, a very hip, modern outlet, which we're pleased to welcome to our series for the first time, Ellen, in your embodiment. She covers foreign affairs, American politics, and other breaking news, and has actually been focusing on Russia's war with Ukraine. Catherine Lawler is a senior intelligence analyst at the Institute for the Study of War in Washington. She focuses on irregular and proxy warfare, state fragility, and disinformation. She, like Susan Eisenhower, has lived in Russia in the past and is very familiar with the circumstances there. Susan, I'd like to turn to you first and ask you a broad and tempting question that's on so many people's minds, I know in the UK and the US and all over the world. What makes Vladimir Putin tick? What is he about?
Well, I think he's a Russian nationalist, and what makes him tick, I guess, only a psychiatrist with Putin on the couch would be able to tell us that. But I think he is driven to assure that Russia somehow earns its rightful place in the global community. The irony, of course, of the special operation, and I put that in quotes, is that has probably undermined his overall objective. But he has been warning us about the marginalization of Russia for really some time.
I've read that he had a very difficult youth on the streets of then Leningrad. And I think maybe you who said previously, he is from Leningrad, not from St. Petersburg.
In a way, he may be from both. In other words, the feeling of the Russian imperial past is on every street corner in St. Petersburg. And even during the siege of Leningrad, you had to have absorbed the great history as they saw their history in even in the Soviet Union. But I do think it's important to note that his family suffered greatly during the siege of Leningrad when the city was surrounded by German forces, and it is a remarkable story of human survival. But probably the takeaway from the siege of Leningrad during World War II is never give up. So I think this is another factor of his personality.
Kat Lawler, what do you think is behind Putin's apparent willingness to gamble so much of Russia's prestige and reputation on this uncertain outcome in Ukraine?
I mean, I don't think he saw it as a gamble. Like Susan said, he has this profound sense of history and of what he calls the Russian world, and believes Ukraine to be a part of that. He honestly believed, and I'm sure his intelligence services supported this narrative, that Russian forces would be welcomed with open arms, that he could take much of Ukraine without a shot being fired, that the Ukrainian forces would shatter immediately, that there is no such thing as Ukrainian nationhood or patriotism, and that Zelensky would flee or be killed. He was wrong on all of those counts, but he's been pursuing the same objectives of recapturing the Russian world, or Novorossiya, since 2014. In 2014, he thought he was going to be able to take 7 regions of Ukraine, and instead he was able to take, 1 and then parts of 2 others. So he's been reading this wrong the whole time. And the reason he couldn't take those regions in 2014 is because the people did not rise up, because they believe themselves to be Ukrainians, not Russians. And so he has a really flawed sense of the history of Ukraine and of the Ukrainian people, frankly. But he did believe this would be a 3-day war, and all of his military and intelligence leaders fed into that narrative for him.
Sandy, could I add one thing to that important point? I think it's important for anyone who's really interested in this field to read about World War II, to read about the beginning of the Russian identity, which is linked closely to Ukraine. And then I would add one more thing. I agree entirely with what's just been said, but I think it's fascinating to note that there's so much intermarriage between Russia and Ukraine, and everybody is related to everybody. And this is what has made this an extremely complicated set of circumstances. The business community is interlinked in many ways. And so this is much more of a cousins war, you might say, than just, 2 neighboring countries that, are not associated deeply from times past, for better, for worse, by the way.
Indeed, and I've heard it said that the president of Ukraine, also Vladimir Zelensky, actually speaks better Russian than he does Ukrainian.
Yeah, that was his first language, actually, is my understanding.
Thank you, Ellen. Yeah.
There is this strong, familial sort of bond in a lot of ways, but and there is a long, strong history. If you'll see, last summer, Putin wrote this very long essay about his understanding of the intermarriage and the shared history and shared destiny of Russia and Ukraine that's available in English. It's available to read, and that gives you a sense of really his viewpoint going into this war. And it's not a predictor of the war per se, but it really is, if not necessarily a reflection of his exact ideology, because we can't know that 100%, it is his justification. And I think that's also a very important thing to think about, because I think, as has been said, unless we cannot know what is in Putin's head, but we can his justification.
If I may add a couple of points here.
Please, Corneliu, I wanted to ask you, by the way, one of your points I hope you'll address is, what do you think about this notion that Putin is trying in some way to reestablish the Soviet sphere of influence in a much broader area in Eastern Europe? Please go ahead, though.
Absolutely. So what I had in mind, I mean, just to build on the previous point and also the one raised by Susan before, that we have to remember that Putin started differently, right? So it's not the Putin that we see nowadays. Initially, he started as a political reformer, and for a few years tried to do something in terms of balancing a little bit, you know, the economic, the financial books, and so on. I remember Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of UK, saying that initially he trusted Putin for this reason, but at some point, Tony Blair said, these reforms in Russia proved quite difficult. So when you are faced with this kind of impossible task to reform the country, you do the old autocratic thing and turn to nationalism. I think there was a combination of both. Yes, history is very much important in the way that shaped the way in which Putin sees Eastern Europe, but also his incapacity to reform Russia, because Russia at the moment, it's in a very bad state, military, economically, demographically, and that is his burden. That's clearly his burden. He had an opportunity in early 2010 to do something about this, and he failed. He couldn't turn Russia democratic, and that's an open question to what extent this remains a feasible project. Now, turning back to the question of Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, I think that's another part of the story. Ukraine, indeed, if you remember Zbigniew Brzezinski, his book on chess, the Grand Chess book, he mentioned Ukraine as being part of this imperial project. Without Ukraine, there is no imperial project for Russia in Europe. It's basically turning towards Asia. So that obsession with Ukraine has been there, and Brzezinski and Eastern Europeans, by the way, recognize it because they've been neighboring this country for a long time. But there was something else. And what I think it triggered also Putin to act now is that he saw this bigger competition between the United States and China, and saw that Russia has no place at the table. And by engaging in this kind of situation, he thought he might be able to regroup and gain some influence in the new Grand Chess, let's say. So I think that's part of the discussion. Remember, in December 2000 last year, he sent a letter through Lavrov to Eastern European asking NATO to withdraw all the troops, not only, you know, it's not only about Ukraine, all the troops from Eastern Europe, from the Baltics to Romania to Bulgaria, everywhere. So it fueled this kind of impression that his intention is much bigger than Ukraine at that time. So I think these two elements might complete a little bit, you know, the story, the bigger picture, and also the failed leadership in early 2000.
Cornelia has a remarkably important thing to say there. And I would add to this further that when Putin first came to office, he was trying very hard to recalibrate Russia's relationship with the West. NATO expansion, for better or for worse, came as a surprise based on the negotiations before the collapse of the Soviet Union. But here's the thing, by the early 2000s, Russia had already defaulted on its debt in '98. And then you get a Putin who is reaching out to the West in profound ways. After 9/11, and I heard him say this personally, after 9/11, he said he was deeply honored to be the first head of state to call George W. Bush and extend his condolences. And then, very few people realize this, the Russian intelligence community opened up their archives and their past intelligence on Afghanistan on behalf of the United States of America. Not long after that, we abrogated the ABM Treaty, which was extremely important from Russia's security standpoint, or so they say. So, you know, he's had a very rocky road. And I think this is the decline of relations with the West, or a feeling of however he views this, but the double decline, as Cornelia outlined the domestic one, but I would add the international one, you know, has played a big role in where he sits now.
Right. Does Putin at this stage, I wonder if Kat or Ellen might like to comment on this. At this stage, does he really care what others think about him? Is he sensitive to those issues, or has he been burned and just moving forward with what he thinks he needs to do? Kat.
I think he's very sensitive to the perception of Russia's role in the world and Russia's prestige, Russia's sovereignty. I don't know how personalized that is, and I wouldn't necessarily comment on that, except that he has been overseeing Russia for 20 plus years. But I think that this war has profoundly damaged the perception of Russia globally, and in turn, profoundly damaged the various campaigns that Putin has been pursuing for his decades in power to rebuild a sense of Russian greatness. I'm still not sure how he's going to come back from that. And I'm not at all sure if he can, in the next decade, revive any sense of Russian greatness on the world stage, but that has to be a primary objective for him.
Ellen, he comes across as sort of cruel and cynical these days. Is that, do you think he likes that reputation?
Well, that's not really new. I mean, if you remember even back to 2014 when the Olympics popped into mind, and his attitude toward LGBT people really almost, I don't know how close it came to torpedoing that that chance for him to host the Olympics there and show off Sochi and show off Russia or the Russian Federation to an international stage. But his standing was poor before this, and he was seen as quite craven and cruel in many ways before this. So I don't think that's necessarily a change. It's just a different expression. And additionally, it's important not to forget violence and war that he has waged in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria. All of those were precursors to what we're seeing right now in Ukraine, and you see many of the same incredibly cruel tactics deployed, bombing cities to absolute rubble. I have not had any confirmed use of chemical weapons in the present conflict, but his assistance with helping the Assad regime use chemical weapons in Syria, like these are all really horrible, inhumane things. So this is a reputation he's been living with for quite a long time. And I also want to make the point that his reputation within Russia and to the Russian people, and how he comes off to them, like that's a really important thing to him as well. Maybe equally as important or more important even than how he appears on the international stage, because it's he depends on the Russian people to keep him in power. So those are really important things to consider as well.
Sure. Corneliu, I'm sorry, you were about to say something before.
Yeah, it reminds me, Putin's behavior reminds me from this great line from written by Machiavelli in The Prince. What is better, to be loved or to be feared? And Machiavelli gave an answer at that time. Said, well, to be loved is not good, especially for an authoritarian leader. It's not good because to be loved is fickle. It goes away. It dissipates quickly. So if you want, fear is more enduring. It's pain. So I think Putin enjoyed this image, enjoys very much, because fear, intimidation, and we see that over and over again. It's not about an accident that he's forced. I think he's trying to project that type of image. And we have to remember that he always desired to be respected, to sit at the table with the big leaders. He comes from this position in which he associates himself probably with the nation, but I think it's also about himself, to be respected. And his talk about Peter the Great, well, it's not going to happen, is it? Right? I mean, it's not going to be viewed as Peter the Great. It's going to be viewed as Putin the horrible. I don't know. But from this point of view, I think what it has happened in the past few months, I think is very damaging for himself. Remember all these meetings in which he is not allowed to go because nobody wants to take a picture with him, or when he is made to wait by the President Erdogan, by the other allies, the former countries from Central Asia made him wait in public at Samarkand in Uzbekistan. These are questions and these issues that I think he's taking them personally from this point. And it has repercussions domestically, as Alan said. I think when you are seen weak in an authoritarian state, it's not good for you. You've seen now there is the leader of the Wagner group who's trying to assert himself through his army, through his St. Petersburg troll factory, so weakness in autocratic system, it's a very bad omen. So I think he cares deeply about that, but he doesn't have too many options at this stage, except for these nuclear threats who tries to project every single week.
Susan, do you think he's... Go ahead.
I was going to say, what's striking for me is how different the calculation is today than it was historically. I think it was Dwight Eisenhower who said in 1953, on assuming the White House just after, the Soviet Union broke the, no, I guess that happened in the summer of 53, broke the US monopoly on the hydrogen bomb, that everything had changed. And that, we don't actually factor in the nuclear question in the way we think about this as a set of problems. I would commend everybody some reading on the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is striking how differently we're handling this situation. And I would say that maybe at the end of the day, since there is no, that finding an off-ramp is a lot more complicated than seeing continuing escalation, that we might learn a few lessons from John Kennedy and others about just how to talk to people. There seems to be no hesitation to call people names while we're in the middle of what could be an existential crisis if we don't, worry about miscalculation and other concerns in the arms control area.
Susan, do you think that there is a factor here of some people in the West sort of playing both ends against the middle, knowing they have to talk to Putin to some extent, but waiting for him to fall, waiting for him to be overthrown and find out what's coming next?
Well, I do realize that I represent a generation that's passing in terms of US-Russian relations. I was very fortunate in my career to go for the Department of Energy, to be deeply involved in cooperative threat reduction programs. We, and this came from the Clinton administration, was deeply concerned of what would happen if there were a failed state in New Russia. I remember all the talk about loose nukes and scientists, nuclear scientists who would go off and sell their expertise to Iran and elsewhere. And so I think the thing that's missing from this conversation is not whether we like Putin or not. We're all appalled by what's happened. But we do have to understand that this is in the context of something that is geopolitical, geostrategic, and complicated by the fact that we have this colossus to the east of Russia that we say is our biggest threat and concern. So I'd say we have some strategic incoherence going on here, and it would be helpful and more reassuring for all of us, I think, if we had the nuclear question more in mind as we think about this problem.
That's a timely comment, because just today, the day we're doing this program, on the 14th of November, President Biden has met personally with Xi Jinping of China, and everyone's wondering what they actually talked about and whether they talked about Ukraine at all, and whether that in any way looms as a potential threat to Putin, that the people he has to worry about one way or another might be talking about him and speculating on what lies ahead. Kat, I'm sorry. Everybody should feel free to jump in when you want to. I'm just the traffic cop.
I guess to your point, Sandy, I'm glad you brought up Xi Jinping. You know, you can't really make any parallels between, or you can't overlay one world leader with another, because they're all dealing with different situations and they're different people with different psychologies and different capabilities. But Xi has really been telegraphing a lot of increased Chinese might, a lot of increased Chinese power militarily, and that's been going on for the past 25 years. But I do think there are some interesting parallels, like the economic situation in China Xi is not incredibly popular. So there is but he's also just grabbed a third term in office and really opened himself up to be leader for life. And so you do have a lot of indications that there is a real authoritarian turn in China as well. So I think that's something that is important to keep an eye on. I do think it's very important that Xi and Biden are meeting and talking. I do think anytime dialogue is going on, especially in such a public way, I mean, there's always back channel dialogue going on. Like, I would assume that there's back channel dialogue. In fact, we know there's back channel dialogue going on between the United States and Russia, particularly concerning the nuclear issue, and I would imagine others as well. But anytime there's public dialogue between leaders, anytime there's a public meeting, like, that's an indication that at least those lines of communication are open, and that's incredibly, incredibly important.
Kat, your institution focuses on the study of war. And have you been thinking, worrying, speculating that these events in Ukraine could lead, whether directly or indirectly, to World War III?
I think that risk has, it's certainly there. I think it has been understandably somewhat overstated in that it is the scariest option, and we all want to look at the scariest options. Right now, we haven't seen any indications that the Kremlin is planning to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I think the battlefield will largely determine that calculation for them, but it is ultimately, in an authoritarian regime, a very personal decision for Putin. And at the point that we cannot make a call on what Putin personally is feeling at any given moment, I would just say that on the battlefield, there's very little indication to me that the use of a nuclear weapon would be operationally useful based on the deterrence that NATO states have put forward. So you could have a scenario in which Russia decides to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine to achieve a battlefield objective. Russian doctrine suggests that you should then have your forces charge forth into the breach and enter these irradiated areas and make use of that shock and advantage. Russian forces are so degraded, I would be absolutely floored if any unit in the Russian military would be willing to or able to undertake such an operation. And the consequences of using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine are so severe based on what has been heavily implied, and I'm sure directly stated in back channel discussions between NATO states and the Kremlin, that would probably involve large-scale conventional strikes on Russian military capabilities in Ukraine, probably not force concentrations, but headquarters, munition stores, all of that, that would then make the utility of one or more small nuclear weapons kind of zero out. So I don't see it as super likely in the short term, and I think that the battlefield conditions may change that calculus for both sides.
Susan, do you see any sort of peace treaty or temporary cessation of hostilities in the near future between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I read the reports every day about this set of battlefield advances and this kind of retreat and this, and I should probably be following it a little more carefully than I am, but part of the reason I don't is I think, well, at least my area of expertise is to stand back a lot longer than the next couple of months or even this winter, and try and figure out as a strategist, where is the United States of America going with meeting our challenges? I mean, is China really our greatest threat? If it is, how are we managing this Russia thing when Russia aims to survive? I mean, whether some people like it or not, I mean, people do that. They try to survive, and they're going to sell their oil, on the international market. They're going to be making alliances with whoever is going to help keep them alive, and that's just a fact. We're already seeing it. So I'm concentrated mostly on trying to figure out whether we are setting ourselves up for meeting our long-term objectives, which is, something that I think we get mixed up sometime with short-term thinking. So let me just say that I think it would be phenomenal if Ukraine could demonstrate to Russia that it needs to back off and that their designs are not going to be successful. But I'm just wondering also over the long haul, over the 10 to 20 years, whether they are going to be able to, retain this position against, a country that's got a lot of military resources that they haven't really much brought to bear in this particular crisis. I don't know, but that's the area I'm pursuing.
Corneliu.
I just wanted to follow up quickly on what Catherine mentioned on nuclear weapons, and then go back to to Susan's point about the end game. So I think that President Biden was right to restate directly to Putin that if you use nuclear weapons, you're going to change the face of conflict since 1945. And I think this is part of the discussion with President Xi, and should be part of the discussion with President Xi. Why do I say so? Breaking the taboo of the use of nuclear weapons. This taboo is very important. We know, cases and so on. But it can unleash unexpected consequences, not necessarily in Ukraine. It can unleash a race in Korea, in Japan, not mentioning the disputes between India and Pakistan. Both of them are nuclear powers, right? In which you lower the threshold for using something that it should not be used, right? It's only for deterrence. So I think, this should be part of the discussion, and China should care about this, because then, other countries in the region might think, look, we can have these American guarantees, security guarantees, but maybe a better guarantee is to, given what is happening, to be more careful about that. So it starts a discussion that should not take place, I think. And that, I think, it's also the point that Susan made about the end game. I think what is important at the moment, because a lot of discussion about peace. The question is, what kind of peace? A fragile peace or an enduring peace? A fragile peace, it's one that you may conclude tomorrow with a ceasefire, that it can resume in the spring, right? Once Russian troops may regroup and strike again. An enduring peace, that's a big question. What is an enduring peace in this case? And I agree with Susan. United States is very much focused on competition with China. Without support from United States, Ukraine, Kiev will have had the Russian flag over it, since April. So the fact that it took the lead, United States, is good, but I think the Europeans should step up. It's important for them to do this. There are signs they are thinking about this, developing this kind of European pillar inside NATO, not in competition with NATO, inside NATO. Germany, for instance, started the program, the European Sky Initiative, is trying to build a European integrated air defense systems. 15 countries signed up about 2 weeks ago. The European political community idea of Macron is creating this kind of structure that tries to bring other countries from Caucasus, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, maybe Northern Africa, into the orbit, creating not geopolitical oppressive war, but in terms of building economic relationship, keeping countries stable, so preventing this kind of influence of Russia. So these are good initiatives. So I agree that at the moment, United States provided, again, third time the type of leadership in Europe, but Europeans should step up, and especially with the idea that Russia is not going to leave, geographically speaking, right? It's going to, with Putin or without Putin, is going to be a revisionist state, and probably be very angry in the first 5-10 years, right? But that means, you know, you have to manage this transition in a smart way. Yeah.
I see what you're saying, but then what is the relationship like if Putin does this and then stays in power? How does the West calibrate its relationship? Is it going to sort of forgive and forget a few of his abuses along the way in order to preserve stability? I wonder what various people think about that. If there's a hanging on by Putin, how does the United States, the UK, other Western democracies, how do they handle it? And if he's not, what sort of relationship, what sort of role does the West play in trying to rebuild Russia and help it under a new leader?
Well, you've got a lot of interesting questions there, but I will say it's going to come down to a philosophical question for ourselves. Is this Putin's war or is this Russia's war? And are the Russian people responsible for what Putin is doing? They are being fed a lot of propaganda, but look at the number of people who left the country the minute mobilization was announced. I mean, it was extremely impressive, and the best and the brightest from that country have fanned out across the former Soviet Union. So the question is, I'll tell you, I can answer this from the Cold War perspective, that after this year, by the way, is the 70th, 2023 is the 2023 is the 70th anniversary of the Solarium Project in 1953, which really set the framework, for U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union leading up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the premise of that was that this was a regime problem, that it was not the Russian people. And this is when the United States Information Agency, Sandy, you know it well, and other institutions like that were established to speak directly to the Russian people. So that's going to be a big strategic question for this country. Are we going to hold the entire nation responsible, or are we going to put together a multi-layered strategy to try and address the challenges, whether Putin stays in office or not?
Well, and the other thing that I would add to that is Russia has not had democratic institutions. Like capitalism and democracy are not the same thing. So the fall of the Soviet Union was exciting in a lot of ways, and worldwide there's a lot of enthusiasm around it, and people had Coke and blue jeans and access to rock and roll, but they'd never had any kind of democratic institution. And I think a really interesting book on this subject, or kind of related to this subject, Susan, is the past. The history. The past is the future, or something like that, by Masha Gessen. That really gets to. I'll have to look that up, but it really gets to kind of Russian attitudes, and we don't have a lot of good public opinion polling. We don't have any independent real research onto what Russian people feel and believe and think, because it's incredibly dangerous. But if Putin is not there, then who leads, and what are they leading? I think is a really important question, because there are not institutions in place, and those institutions have been degraded, both in the past 22 years, or such as they existed, and over the course of this war. So who leads? How do they lead? Like, what does that even look like? It's impossible to really even consider, in my mind.
Very good question. Kat, what do you think about outside influence on this? How closely does Putin follow the election returns in the United States and the United Kingdom, the political developments?
I mean, the timing of the surrender of Kherson City suggests that he at the very least follows US midterms. But yes, of course, he's acutely aware of the political realities of what he views as his adversaries, and has taken many, many steps over the previous decades to establish more friendly political parties, more friendly political candidates across Europe, across North America, and around the world. Parties or candidates that may be more friendly to Russia, or maybe more friendly to his revisionism, or may just be more isolationist, such that they are less willing to oppose the Kremlin. But getting back to your previous question a little bit, Sandy, I think any discussion of a peace deal in this context is really premature, in large part because it's not the decision of the United States or its allies. It's absolutely the decision of Ukraine. But more than that, because I think Ukraine has a tremendous amount of momentum right now and has the initiative on the battlefield. So of course, I'm much more involved in looking at the day-to-day movements of the front lines. But I think there's been a lot of discussion in Western media over the last couple of weeks that, oh, well, it's winter now, and everyone knows you don't invade the Soviet Union in the winter, so it must be difficult and things must stop or slow down. And I think that's silly. And I think that that is incompatible with modern warfare, but also incompatible with what we know about the capabilities of the Ukrainian military. So I don't expect to see any slowdown due to weather in the next couple of months. We could see a pause as different campaigns have culminated on both sides, or a slowdown, but I think tying that into winter weather is unrealistic. Practically, if you look at what happens when the ground freezes, it's actually much easier to maneuver, whereas the sort of muddy seasons that you see in Ukraine in the spring and fall make those maneuvers much more difficult. So I think the narrative that we're seeing a lot of, that, oh, now that it's winter, we can all take a pause and take a moment to reassess, and maybe Ukraine and Russia will go to the negotiating table, is incompatible with reality and with what we're seeing on the ground right now.
Also, to add to that, every time we've seen a withdrawal on the part of Russia, we've also seen some sort of recalibration. You know, it's in boxing, like when you step back and you try and put forward your most powerful punch. You know, that's a pattern that we've seen after Kyiv. You know, forced concentrations in the south. And then after Kharkiv, we saw, sorry, this is New York City. There are lots of sirens. Every single interview that I do, I record, and there's always a siren in the background. I sing for the siren.
Of course. No, that's.
But, you know, we saw the partial mobilization after the withdrawal from Kherson. So, you know, I think it's a legitimate question to ask what comes next. And I also think that we can draw some information from the fact that the withdrawal from Kherson was a lot more orderly. We saw it defended in a pretty typical fashion, you know, defended with firepower. Russia destroyed a lot of weaponry, as opposed to the short sort of shambolic withdrawal that we saw from Kharkiv. So there is a lot of data to indicate that, you know, probably we should expect some sort of return from Russia.
Very quickly, if I can, on this issue of how to engage Russia once the war is over. We don't know when that is going to happen, but I think, you know, for someone who grew up in an authoritarian country, what I can say is that from outside, authoritarian states look strong, impenetrable, until they are not. They can collapse overnight. That's the thing about totalitarian states. It can happen tomorrow, it can happen after 10 years. We don't know exactly when. Well, when it happens, it's not going to be that type of democratic transition that we see with midterm elections, United States or United Kingdom, when we have institutions that absorb, you know, the popular discontent and channel it in a different. No, it's not going to happen. It's going to be very abrupt. And I think Susan mentioned before at the beginning of our conversation something interesting, because we've seen this happening in 1991, and there was a big debate, and I fear that we're going to go back to that question. And the question, remember, in 1990, it was the first Bush administration. You have James Baker, Secretary of State, Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense. and they wonder what to do about the Soviet Union. Shall it let it collapse? That was approach favored by Dick Cheney. Or James Baker, so no, because they had 35,000 nuclear weapons, you need a center to hold them together. I fear James Baker won sort of the day at that time, but I fear we'll go back to this question at some point. If a situation evolves in Russia in which, for political, military reasons, the system collapses, how the West are going to react to that? Are they going to follow James Baker's strategy or Dick Cheney, say involuntary collapse is much better? Involuntary, that means that is not stimulated by the West, right? Involuntary, that's something internally, is much better in the long term, despite all the hiatus. It's a question that I fear we'll have to revisit at some point again.
Thanks, Corneliu. That's
I'd
very
like
helpful.
to add something here that's extremely important, I think, which is if, and thank you very much for that comment. I think that was extremely important to remind. As a matter of fact, George H.W. Bush went to Kiev and gave a very powerful speech, urging them to remain part of the Soviet Union. We forget that piece of history too. But if Russia, you have to be careful what you wish for, because if Russia were to collapse, let's ask ourselves who the great beneficiary is going to be. It's going to be China. And I'm not arguing for, taking it easy on Russia. I'm arguing that we should try and clarify what our long-term goals are. I had an opportunity to speak to a number of Russian generals over the years, and the number one thing they were worried about was their long border with China. And actually, one of them even said that, one reason they'd never give up nuclear weapons is on the basis that they might have to redirect them east. Okay, so now that situation has changed remarkably because of current events. But we have to ask ourselves that, who would benefit from having control over these vast natural resources in the east of Russia. So I would just wanted to add that, because you'll have both a set of questions coming from the West, which we can be part of that debate, and we've got a set of questions that will emerge in the East, and we have very little influence over that.
We're going to go in just a second to Mike, to the questions from other participants online. But Susan, before we do, just want to raise briefly and abruptly the question of what in the midterm elections, if Putin is looking closely at this, we all think he liked Trump. He felt that Donald Trump was certainly Donald Trump wanted to feel that Putin was his friend. And one has to assume the feeling was mutual. If the midterm results represent a decline in Trump's influence, how will that affect Putin?
Well, I'm not sure, because we've got a very interesting set of circumstances, which is that I'm sure Joe Biden's feeling empowered today. He said something, about the midterms on his trip to Asia, and it'll be interesting to see whether Joe Biden becomes more conciliatory, having gotten midterms behind him. So I think this is a highly fluid situation. Putin, especially isolated as he is, has very little influence over what anybody's feeling here in the West. But I think he's got to, and he's not an unintelligent man, I think he has to understand that even half of America doesn't know what on earth all this means.
At least half.
At least half, right. So, but it's a highly dynamic situation, which is what makes it so highly dynamic. I'm not going to put a judgment on it. I hope you don't mind.
Mike, over to you.
Fine, thank you. Thank you for a really interesting discussion so far. And I wonder whether we could just continue with the China issue for a minute, because Martin Gim says, in a way, I think that the US and China are complicit in the war, especially the US. These superpowers, I thought, could exert their influence on both Ukraine and Russia to force peace with concessions on both sides. Can the speakers comment on this scenario? Susan, do you want to have a go at that?
I'd like to hear from, I've done an awful lot of talking, so I'd like to invite someone else to take a shot at it.
Ellen?
Sure. I mean, I think there is a desire. One thing that I've noticed over the course of covering this war is the expectation that things will be over quickly. Something that you see in the news media is people, move on quickly, right? Our attention spans are extremely short. So the idea that this is all incredibly, incredibly complicated, and the US and China, Biden's and the US government's long-term talking point throughout this entire conflict has been nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And I think it's important to just reiterate that, yes, the US and China certainly have some, and NATO definitely have a lot of influence, but these are sovereign nations. We can't force them to do anything that they're not ready to do. And there's no indication that a peace deal or a cessation of hostilities is really something that's on the table. And if you do end up with a peace deal after 8 months of war, which is not a long time, how durable is that peace? I mean, we saw in Crimea, that's essentially been a low-level conflict for 8 years, and then Putin pushed toward it again. Looking at the past, at the history of this conflict, we don't have any indication that if there is some sort of agreement there, that's going to be lasting, that's going to be durable. And then where are you if this happens again in 5 years, in 10 years? We're back where we started.
I tend to agree with what Alan said. I mean, let's remember ourselves something. What happened on the February 21st? It was not NATO invading Ukraine. It was not United States invading Ukraine. It was Russia making a war of choice. Nobody attacked Russia. So in England here, there is this tradition of the idea of appeasement. So what, the question suggested, could you, yes, I mean, we had Georgia 2008 and say, okay, maybe we can find an agreement. And that was the case. And then you have Crimea 2014. Again, some minor sanctions with the hope that the lesson will be learned and they will stop. Now we have a big, ugly, horrible, devastating war in the middle of Europe. Where is the line? And I think that's the question. I mean, it's a logic that sort of invites blaming the victim here, because it was not Ukraine invading anyone or NATO. It was the other way around. So that gets us back to the question: what kind of peace do we want? Do we want a peace like in Georgia, like in Crimea in 2014, and then to restart this whole story again in 6 months or in 1 month, in 1 year, for something that is more durable? I don't know the answer to the enduring part of the peace, but that's where we should look for, not a fragile ceasefire that will basically get us back to square one. That's my.
I would like to add, I think I can probably speak for everybody on this panel that we are very interested in peace, that peace is desperately important, and that maintaining that and securing that and doing all that we can in our roles is really, really desperately important. But and I think Susan, probably you can speak to this a lot better than I can, Americans are not good at thinking long-term, and we have to be better about that.
That's why I'm in that business. There's a the niche is rather large, actually. No, I agree. This is going to be one of the very, very complex things, but it does get back to whether this is, I don't like to see big historic analogies used all the time. To be comparing Putin to Hitler, I think does a disrespect to the Holocaust survivors. It doesn't even begin to capture the catastrophe of World War II. 65 million people lost their lives. I mean, this is on an order of magnitude that's entirely different. again, I just feel like I need to say it. This takes nothing away from the brutality and the horror of what we're seeing, but there is a vastly different scale. And I think ultimately Hitler's objectives were far more far-reaching than Putin's are. I could be mistaken about that, but that's the way I read it at the moment. I think this is way more like World War I. This is about great power rivalry, because it's not just Russia and Ukraine. This is part of a larger set of unloosening of relationships, of the way the international community operates. You can throw in there the pandemic, you can get into all sorts of other elements of this. But so back to everything looks stable till it doesn't. I would add to that maybe everything looks like it's manageable until it isn't. And that's what happened in Sarajevo during the First World War. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, are all of these powers, and they don't even have to be economic powerhouses, they just have to have enough advanced weaponry to be, threatening. What does that look like if that's the analysis and not World War II?
I mean, peace sounds great, but who does that peace serve? If peace means freezing the front lines of the conflict where they are now, that leaves hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians in occupied territory where, as we've seen, as Ukraine has liberated more of its territory, there is mass torture going on. There's forced mobilization of Ukrainian civilians to fight against their brethren. There is, atrocities at scale here. And I understand the inclination of the international community to say, yes, we want peace. Peace is good. Everyone wants peace. Of course, Ukraine wants peace. Ukraine didn't want to be invaded in the first place. But Ukraine has to also be empowered to make that decision. If we believe in sovereignty, and the United States is very invested in this world system where we do believe in and support sovereignty, Ukraine's sovereignty is the point of this war, and therefore it is not the role of the United States or of China or of Russia to make decisions on at what point Ukraine draws the line for its own sovereignty. And at this stage, if things did freeze along the current front lines, I'm not sure Ukraine could survive long-term as a state economically. It needs to retake some of its industrial capabilities and its manufacturing capabilities. It needs to ensure its access to the Black Sea. All of these things are incredibly important. And it's not the role of the United States, as President Biden has repeatedly said, to make decisions about the future of Ukraine. But we can support Ukraine's attempts to defend its own sovereignty. Similarly, of course, China has interests in this war. It's interested in not violating the nuclear taboo. It's interested in undermining the US-led world order, just as Russia is. But even in that scenario, I don't think China has the ability to force Russia to the negotiating table, nor am I sure that it has the will to do so. So I think the premise of the question is really somewhat disrespectful to the existence of the Ukrainian state and to the importance of Ukrainian sovereignty, which is why they are fighting.
Sandy, I'm compelled to say something rather controversial here. I want to believe everything that Kat just said. But then, my heart hurts when I think about the way the United States of America left Afghanistan. So much for being invested in sovereignty. And I do think, and I'm not, trying to muddy the waters here, but the United States of America needs to really sit down and have a hard think about some of the things we've done. Not because it forgives anybody else for doing the same thing, but just because, as during the first Cold War, we have to be in the business of trying to win friends and influence people in a positive way. But we attacked a sovereign country in Iraq that made no moves towards us at all. And I don't like to see Putin use that as propaganda against this country, and he wouldn't even have any power to do so if we ourselves would, examine some of the tenets by which we have undertaken some of our overseas activities.
And I totally agree with that. I think consistency in our foreign policy and orienting around core principles and agreeing on what those core principles should be is profoundly important. I would just say also that Putin is an expert propagandist and employs an army of expert propagandists, but that we can't say that because we have given him fodder for propaganda, which we absolutely have repeatedly, that then justifies the use of his propaganda. Because with Ukraine, we saw the US and allied intelligence communities expertly pre-bunk various Russian information operations and various false flag attacks and things. And we should be doing more of that, and we should be more consistent.
Well, I completely support what we're doing. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that look at what, I mean, and maybe this was the benefit of President Biden learning from the mistakes in Afghanistan, but it's harrowing. It's harrowing. And when you think about how we left that country and how much weaponry was left behind and the rest of it, and the number of American friends we left behind, it's right that we learn from that mistake. But it's also not right that we never read about it in the newspaper anymore.
It's getting worse every single day too. So
is it? I'm sure it is. And last time I checked, we spent trillions of dollars on an international war on terrorism, and we don't even worry about terrorist challenges of the 9/11 sort. So I don't know how I got down this rabbit hole, but
well, and
let
just
me come in with
to
another question, because Angela Preston actually is a great supporter of these discussions. So hello, Angela. She asked 3 questions. I think you've touched on, well, you've done more than touch on a couple of them. She said, do you think that Putin needs to win something for this to end peacefully? She also asked, what do you think the United States needs to do to create peace in Ukraine? And then coming to the final point you were just talking about, Angela asks, do you think the news media can intensify problems in the Ukraine by their discussions of Putin? Ellen.
Yeah, to that last point, that's something that we always struggle with all the time. Like, these are things that I'm thinking about all the time, right? How is, and we saw this, I mean, it's not just Putin, it's the elections in the United States. And, to Catherine's point earlier, we know that things we say and things that we write are going to be used as propaganda tools. Like, that's something that I know because I know Russian warfare doctrine, and I know that disinformation is an incredibly important part of that asymmetric warfare. Does that stop me from saying what is true? Does that keep me from, talking to people and making sure that my audience is informed about what's going on and what I personally am reading, hearing about? If we thought about that all the time, we would be completely paralyzed. And also, Putin is like, that's his goal, right? That's his end game. So he's going to figure out how to do that, whether or not I write about, Ukrainian sovereignty, whatever. Like, he's going to do that no matter what. So I think constraining ourselves based on, a lot of journalists, and this is like going to sound kind of high-minded, and like there are a lot of problems in media and journalism. Like, I'm not saying that that's not true, but we like to think, or we strive to report without fear or favor. And if I and my colleagues, whom I greatly respect, let the fear of whatever Putin is going to do to our words stop us from saying what we know to be true, then no information would get out. And
I'd just like to add something here, because I think the answer to that question was influenced by what I said about Afghanistan. I want to be very clear about this. I don't think that there is any question that Ukrainian sovereignty should be protected and promoted. And I'm glad to see that that is the US rule. About Afghanistan, it was heartbreaking that the Afghan government wasn't even at the table when the agreement was negotiated. So we have learned from that. The question is it time for a flat out peace agreement or not? I would be perfectly happy to see just some talking around nuclear norms and shoring up nuclear norms, because this is a question for Ukraine. Ukraine has been a deeply divided country since the collapse of the Soviet Union because, Joseph Stalin organized the borders the way he did to make sure that all of these republics would have, challenging domestic situations and wouldn't rise up against him. So I just wanted to clarify that. Actually, there's no distance between these comments that have been made and me. It's just that we are really coming out of a very searing experience in Afghanistan, and that may be one of the reasons that we've been able to muster the support inside this country to stand united around this issue.
Well, I also
Cornelia wanted to come in. Cornelia.
Yeah, may I add something to this as well? I think the reason I don't think that peace is in the cards at the moment is not necessarily because of Ukraine or the advance, is because I don't hear anything from Moscow, Kremlin, Putin, Lavrov, and the others saying simple words, meaning that we don't want, the original objectives to conquer Ukraine. I haven't heard anything of that kind. Initial objectives that they wanted, overthrow the government, denazification, demilitarization, nothing of the kind has changed. And that worries me. What kind of peace you want to achieve with someone that denies or obscures or ignores the core elements of the military, of the war? And I think that ties also into this discourse a little bit that we heard initially from Macron and the other, don't humiliate Putin. I think nobody tries to humiliate Putin. Putin humiliates himself by the way in which he acts, right? And I think it's not about humiliation here. It's about the fact that they have to recognize that, they are, in terms of reaching this objective, this is not acceptable. And I think that should be a basis for starting negotiations in understanding that Ukraine is an independent state, that all the stories that I think Ellen mentioned with this article from last year about the unity, which was a historical, distorted narrative, horrible one, which invites cultural genocide, right? Erasing a country off the map culturally, that is cultural genocide. And we've seen examples, practical examples, stealing all the cultural artifacts from museums, teaching people, kids, new curriculums that oblige them to learn a different type of history.
Yeah.
So I haven't heard anything of that kind from.
Oh dear.
I think we're frozen. Mike, can you hear us?
Well, I certainly agree with everything that was said there. And I think that this is another reason why I think a peace agreement is way premature. I just want to say one more thing, which is I don't ever want anyone to think I was suggesting that there's any equivalency between US actions and what Putin thinks he can get away with, because there is no equivalency. I just think that we need to be focused on the interplay in the whole former Soviet area, including, and I'm going to include Afghanistan in that too, because this is a bigger thing. It's not just about this war. It's connected in all kinds of ways, from grain to energy to everything else. This is a global crisis, not just one between two countries.
I think on that note, we're going to have to bring it to a close. We're almost at the end now. So can I also apologize to some of our questioners, but they were sending questions. I haven't been able to ask them because the debate was going in such an interesting way that I thought to come in and disturb it wouldn't be quite right. But thank you, particularly Fernando Herreros to Oslo, that I haven't got to your questions. I'm going to hand over back to Sandy. Do you want to say anything in conclusion, Sandy?
Yeah, this was the epitome of what we're seeking to do with this series of programs, and it was very hard to keep it restrained and go to our questioners. I understand, but I want to thank all the people who participated for their really very eloquent and clear comments. Mike and I are now embarking on our third year of these programs. I think this is the first one in the third year, and it gives us strength and courage to move on when we have a conversation like this. So I do want to say thanks to all the people at Georgetown University who have supported, and our outside supporters too, like the Knight Foundation. President Jack DeJoy of Georgetown has promoted this kind of international dialogue, and counted on Mike and me to do it. Tom Bancroft, the Vice President for International Affairs as well. And many people, John McCabe, who works with me on the Free Speech Project, has been essential to it, and many students who work with us as well. So thanks everyone. We'll carry on, but back to you for the moment, Mike.
Well, thank you, Sandy, as well. And can I add my thanks to Susan, Catherine, Cornelia, and Ellen for a really fascinating debate. I mean, it's not been a debate that's made us feel happy in any way. I don't think. It's just enforced the seriousness of the situation and the complexity of where we all are with this awful war that's going on. And we shouldn't forget that within a war there are casualties, as we are speaking at the moment, one way or another, on both sides. And sometimes in the politics we forget that. But thank you so much for your discussion. It was wonderful, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this again, Sandy. You know, this is the second conversation that we've had about Russia and the Ukraine and the war. The next Free Speech Project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event, in association with the Future of the Humanities Project, will be on Monday the 5th of December, when we'll be discussing hacking for fun or profit, or might I add, for politics maybe. So anyway, it's going to be hacking that we're coming to on the 5th of December. Tomorrow there's the 15th of November, in the Bent and Beautiful World Literature, Arts and the Environment series, Ana Dili Morales from Georgetown will be talking to the Colombian artist Blanca Botero about Blanca's work. And here we have a discussion going on tomorrow where at least we're reinforcing some issues, positive issues about the environment and about culture and about nationalities that don't often find themselves to the forefront in cultural discussions. So Blanca Botero, wonderful artist, in discussion tomorrow, 15th of November, and I hope you'll join us for that. I'm afraid that I'm very happy to tell you that the current the Christian Literary Imagination Symposium and Conference to take place in Oxford on the 12th and 13th of December is completely full. So we can't take anybody at the moment, any more people at the moment, but if you are interested in attending, we do have a waiting list. So and we will put you on the waiting list and try to get you in if we can, but there's been a tremendous demand for that conference. And of course we're coming back with to DC with something in March, when we'll be talking again about Christian literary imagination. So look for that. That'll be a live conference live lectures anyway in Georgetown. My thanks also to all the support we get from Georgetown University. My thanks to Campion Hall, Nick Austin, the Master, Vanessa Hack, and Ying Ying, our administrators. My personal thanks to John McCabe for the work he does in Georgetown for us to get this on the road. Laura Lee's my UK publicist, and Maggie Scott without whom we wouldn't be able to get these things going at all, I don't think, not from this end. So I'd like to thank everybody who asked questions. Apologies they weren't all put today. Thank everybody who's attended today. It's been a great discussion. I'm Professor Michael Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until the next time, take care, keep safe. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you.